We're joined now by Saurabh Amari. He's actually my colleague at Unheard and wrote a very, very interesting piece this week that Crystal flagged for us. We wanted to talk about. The headline is Elon Musk is a danger to Trumpism. And we should mention before we dive in that Saurabh and I also have a new newsletter that you can sign up for over at unheard.com. It's called Area 47. It's kind of inside scoop from Trump world with a very unheardy lens. We're having fun over there. So go ahead and sign up. And Saurabh, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's so good to join you on yet another platform, Emily.
Great to have you. Can you walk through the argument that you lay out in this article, especially through the lens of somebody who is on the right and is looking at what's just happened over the course of the first 3 weeks of the Trump presidency? And there's a lot, probably to be critical of that people are dancing around or glossing over that you actually lay out here openly.
Yeah, so I start with the case of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB, not a friendly acronym. And I tell the story of Rohit Chopra, who was President Biden's now ousted or outgoing director of the CFPB. He did some numerous reforms that I think were pro-Main Street, helping ordinary Americans who have very little bargaining power against banks and now big tech companies that increasingly act like financial institutions. One of the things that he proposed just in his final days in office was a rule against debanking. This is basically that your financial institution can drop you as a customer based on your views or what you use your account to fundraise for or what you've said online. And this was remarkable because it was kind of politically conciliatory. It's not just good policy, but in a way you have here someone from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party taking on a practice that mostly has been used against right-wing activists, like PayPal debanked an evangelical fundraising site that was raising money for January 6th defendants. Canadian truckers who protested the COVID mandates were debanked at the behest of the Canadian government. In Britain, Nigel Farage faced debanking for a while from his financial institution, which is called Coots. Anyway, it was something that the right was exercised about, and he just with a very swift rule that says customers cannot be dropped based on their exercise of free speech, would have put a stop to it. Now, that's not the only thing the CFPB did. It did lots of good things, but Musk had said that the CFPB must die, and sure enough, he did it. Not just Musk, by the way. Mark Zuckerberg also went on Joe Rogan's show complaining about why he's getting oversight from the CFPB. Well, it's because they track their Facebook users' financial transactions and stuff. They surveil people, and so they're acting more and more like a financial institution. As Chopra himself told me, it's not that we are encroaching into big tech; it's that big tech is encroaching into the financial system.
Yeah, and Mark Andreessen too went on Rogan to complain about CFPB, talk about how it was debanking people, and the debanking, I think, point is a great entry into your piece and to the whole conversation, because privately, Andreessen and the others, I don't think actually would be satisfied by what Chopra did at CFPB with his debanking rule, because it said you cannot debank people for ideological reasons. But of course, you can still debank people for being drug traffickers, or for working with cartels, working with sanctioned organizations. Like there's it's called Know Your Customer. And it's one of the things that some elements of Silicon Valley have been so hostile to, this idea that you have, as a financial institution, some responsibility to know who your customer is and whether or not they are just, whether you're dealing with El Chapo. They hate that. They think that that's an encroachment on their freedom to do Bitcoin commerce or whatever. And so when Andreessen talks about them having so many founders who were debanked, he's doing this kind of two-step where he's trying to make Rogan's audience think that these Silicon Valley tech founders were debanked because they supported Trump or because they said something critical of like George Floyd or Black Lives Matter or something. When in fact, if you look at each case, it's like, oh, like they were they were moving crypto for a cartel. And so the bank was like, we're freezing this. And so for Chopra to come in and deal with the actual problem that people had is interesting, because it shows that he's kind of responsive to the genuine public concern, but the public concern is not the actual oligarch concern. They're just kind of using that. So I guess answer the charge that you've gotten online of, and I get this too, on the left or on the right, of naivete. That what did you expect? It's a bunch of oligarchs who got Trump into office. Did you actually believe they were going to do this?
Yeah. So I get very irritated by that, because I wrote a number of pieces in the lead up to the election as someone on the populist wing of the right, or the pro-worker conservative. We have different names for people like me. Conservative social democrat. I'm very concerned about Elon's influence. I wrote a piece for the New Statesman before the election, where the headline was, "Trump will have to choose populism or Elon Musk." So it's not, I always saw that, and I know the administration is torn between these competing impulses. But what I will say is, like, the degree to which Elon has been empowered, Elon and that kind of coterie of the so-called techno-libertarian right, it is a little bit disturbing, especially what I see as self-dealing, right? So Elon wants to create an app out of X that is not just a social media company, but a kind of everything app like they have in China with WeChat. So it's your payment system. It can do all sorts of things. And the CFPB would have brought scrutiny to bear on what he was doing on the financial side of it. And he says, kill it, and it is done. That's very disturbing. Another one, which I mentioned in the piece, is what's happening in the National Labor Relations Board. So President Trump came in and he dismissed the general counsel of the NLRB. That's quite expected, because President Biden did the same thing to Trump 1's general counsel. But then he also dismissed, without cause or notice, as required by both statutory law and Supreme Court precedent, one of the members, Gwynne Wilcox, who can only be dismissed for malfeasance or neglect, causes like that, and there's no indication that she's done anything like that, and also with notice, and she didn't receive notice. Now, what that does is basically the NLRB needs, under Supreme Court precedent, needs a quorum in order to actually uphold labor law, to enforce the Wagner Act or the National Labor Relations Act. Now, this happens against the backdrop in which Elon Musk and one other of the oligarchs who stood on the stage at the swearing in, namely Jeff Bezos of Amazon, have launched a lawsuit to declare the National Labor Relations Act unconstitutional altogether. Now, that's a drastic legal argument, and it's questionable whether, even with a conservative Supreme Court, they're going to be able to kill the National Labor Relations Act, which is the fundamental labor law in this country. But, is there a better alternative? Yes, basically to cripple the agency, which is what happens when you remove its quorum. Local NLRB offices can still investigate and so on, but when it comes to an actual labor dispute where the board as a whole has to uphold collective bargaining, it can't do that. And what I've heard is that they intend to keep things that way, essentially crippling the agency.
So Rob, one thing that I've heard from people in Trump world, or this argument from people who are sympathetic to Musk and DOGE, is that this is basically a generational opportunity to deal with the problem of waste, fraud, and abuse in the government, which I think probably all of us agree is significant. There's it's sort of an inevitability, of course, and whether they're able to make a big dent in it without touching things like Medicare and Social Security, I mean, you basically can't. You could eliminate the Pentagon and still probably you couldn't put a dent really in the debt and the deficit. So on the one hand, there's this genuinely important question of streamlining the federal government, making it more efficient, and helping people in ways that are kind of populist in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases kind of populist. On the other hand, there's the idea that this is all being done by a literal oligarch, like as close as you can get in the American system to an actual oligarch. So how do you think about the balance between this worthy goal, noble goal of cutting down on largesse and actually, making the spending of taxpayer money more efficient, and on the other hand, having it sort of done by someone who at least has the potential to be a corporate raider for his own cause.
Yeah, so I that's a great question. We have to mentally separate different things here. The first is that if you want social reform that empowers working people and consumers, that's not necessarily tantamount to supporting everything that's associated with big government. Like just a bloated administrative apparatus can actually be, as conservatives know this well, but it can be pretty oppressive to ordinary people, and it can be gamed by incumbents to their own advantage. So it's telling, for example, that in Mexico, President AMLO, as he's popularly known, very left-wing president, he actually slashed the size of government, and he cut off all sorts of like magazines and NGOs and stuff that survived only because the Mexican taxpayer was subsidizing them. And the Mexican kind of progressives, think about the Mexican equivalent of the Brooklyn left, were really, really angry with AMLO the whole time he was in power. They hated him, in part because he had cut them off from the public dole. And yet, at the same time, he did things that empowers ordinary people relative to employers, relative to capital. So like raising the minimum wage, making it easier to organize workplaces and so on. So it's not just like if you're in favor, if you consider yourself pro-worker or pro-labor or pro-consumer, you should just want bigness in government for its own sake in every direction. But two things have to happen for this kind of reform. One is it can't be so self-dealing. It can't. The guy who has an obvious, imminent material interest in deleting, quote unquote, some agency should not be the one wielding that kind of scalpel. It's not even a scalpel, unfortunately. It's like an axe. It's a different thing. And the second thing I'd say is there are two different kinds of administrative agency. One is one that is just directly overseeing society, and I think those can be quite oppressive. However, agencies that came out of the New Deal, there's many more of them. All the various like trade commissions, et cetera. The New Deal era, a New Deal order.
NLRB, yeah.
And then I think of the CFPB the same way. Is more they're playing umpire. They're playing umpire between different social forces. So the state is mediating between labor, capital, consumers, state-backed electricity co-ops, et cetera, et cetera. Those are not big government. What they're doing is just restraining the power of a few market giants and allowing, encouraging the other side of the market to exert what used to be called countervailing power by the New Dealers. That's the difference, and I think of Social Security, by the way, in the same vein. Social Security is not a big government program. It's not coming from the taxpayer, and FDR deliberately set it up that way. Going back to the 19th century and even the early 18th century, workers had set up these basically mutual organizations of mutual aid, where if one of them fell ill, the rest of them had contributed and they could take care of that person's family, or if he died, the widow. What the Social Security program did was take and just codify that and formalize it into a system. But because it's not funded by the taxpayer, it's impossible to quote unquote reform, or very difficult. We'll see if Elon tries to go there. So I agree that like big government for its own sake in every direction, sure, challenge that. It can be oppressive. But when the state plays umpire and tries to level the economic playing field between different social forces, I think that shouldn't be touched.
But I'm just kind of curious, by the way, just in general, what makes people like you, a conservative social democrat, not just a social democrat? Like, what's the
Well, that becomes a more philosophical question. So I think social democracy, and we should say social and Christian democracy, they're kind of like twin traditions. In the US, the closest equivalent we have is the New Deal tradition, is conservative, right? It is, in other words, I'm not saying I'm not like a right-wing guy who then occasionally says stuff to get like a pat in the head from like the New York Times or whatever. It's because as a person who wants to see a social order that is not completely disruptive to workers' lives, that conduces to family formation, things like that. Well, capitalism is a profoundly revolutionary force. It's very good at doing things efficiently and so on. We all know its benefits, but it can also be pretty disruptive. So as a conservative, I want to restrain that, to try to bring it under, if we're going to have disruption, let's have it subject to political contestation rather than just having, the few, the very, very powerful, direct the nature of
So
social.
it's like a twist on the Buckley line where you're standing athwart the tide of capitalism and yelling stop.
Yelling stop.
Yeah, I guess so.
Works for me.
So one last very quick point is that also that like the New Dealers, the Social Democrats of old, they were trying to prevent revolution, right? Like they were.
Yeah.
The idea was to stabilize the system in order to not have authoritarian leftism or authoritarian rightism come up. It was a conservative impulse, and I think the people who call themselves democratic socialists would be offended to hear that. But the fundamental impulse here is not to. We don't want totally classless society. Very few people do. Only like really hardcore tankies. It's about restraining, keeping it under some political control, keeping it, making the market safe for society is a good way to put it.
Saurabh, such a, I think, important piece. So thank you for coming here to discuss some of this as it happens. Changes by the hour, seemingly, and we appreciate your time.
Thank you both, and it's good to join my colleague on a different show.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.